All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. These are our screencasts for this week regarding the Harding and Coolidge presidency. If you haven't downloaded these notes yet, go to Canvas right below this screencasted video, and please download the notes, print it, or type in the notes as you see them as they come up on the screen. So I do want to make sure you have every opportunity to get these notes here to get started. So without further ado, let me get going with these notes. So remember, pick us up where we left off. World War I ends. Woodrow Wilson cannot get the Treaty of Versailles a part of U.S. law, and he also cannot get the Americans to join the League of Nations. America is not in the mood to be a part of the rest of the world yet. Not that because we're selfish or anything like that. I think we solved and fixed everyone else's problems by getting involved in the war and helping the Allies to win the war. Now we want to worry about ourselves. We've been worried about others for a long time. It's time to worry about ourselves now. And this is what Harding preached in his return to normalcy. In 1920, after Wilson finishes up his last years in office, after suffering from that stroke that he had, it is now time for a new president to come in to office. And Warren Harding is many people's favorite choice because he believes in this return to normalcy. He believes this is exactly what America needed. There's a speech that we've read at some point. I'm not going to post that up for you. It's nothing important to that. But all that means that this return to normalcy is to return America back to the way it was. Prior to the war, prior to a lot of the progressive changes that had occurred, Americans are tired of progressive changes, keeping up with everything. America just wants to be able to build itself back up again, and that's exactly what Harding preaches here. So when we look at both of these candidates here, when we go forward into these ideas, the demand for Republicans and people that were of conservative mindset after World War I is over is mostly because of the goals in which they favored. Big business and the restoration of social stability. Both of these individuals, Harding and Coolidge, believed that this was the key to economic success. The idea that, getting businesses to operate fully at full capacity so they expand larger than they've ever been before, to help provide jobs for the American people, to provide consumer items for the American people. Keep in mind now, in the United States, after World War I is over, the American populace was unable to buy consumer goods during the war because most companies were making goods for the war. So you could not have a better situation for the American people, that they've saved up their money. They worked a lot during this war, whether from home or being in the military. They've earned their ability to now, indulge themselves in consumer items. And for Harding and Coolidge, it was up to big business to provide that for them. And the government should not get in the people's way. And that's exactly what both of these individuals believed. And it should not be up to the government to interfere in the decisions made by businesses. All right, they found these as the recipe for economic growth. All right. So, and then again, at any point, if I move too fast for you here throughout this slide, just pause the video at any moment, and then you can go back and get those notes. All right. For his, the first president here, Warren Harding, he was a glad-hander, someone who had a great, big, huge personality. Wasn't seen as the most intelligent man in the room, but he did do his best to try to surround himself with some intelligent people in some positions. We'll talk later how he made a mistake in others. But Harding, really deeply believed in isolationism. Keeping America away from political alliances. We still wanted to work with nations when it comes to trade, but from a political standpoint, keeping yourselves out of those affairs and dealing and helping solve the world's problems is not our goal. We can still trade, we can still work together, but we cannot work to figure out how to figure out or how to solve all of Europe's problems or how to solve the world's problems. It's not our goal. All right. Harding also in his foreign policy calls for international disarmament. He actually gets a conference together of people. In the videos I posted below these notes and screencasts, you can see Harding and Coolidge's videos. Well, Harding does a good deal to get a lot of international agreements between countries to limit their naval arms, ships, submarines, to limit the amount that countries can, make for themselves to you want to go to war. So, disarming the world, disarming countries was a big key to prevent future wars like we saw in World War I. People were right on board with this. This is big for Harding and his administration to continue. All right. He also wants to continue international trade. However, It's going to be at the expense of Europe, mostly because Harding wants to raise import taxes or tariffs on goods coming into the United States. It's just all to make American goods more desirable. As American businesses switch from war production to consumer goods, making those goods that people can buy on a daily basis or a yearly basis, depending on what they are, cars, shoes, clothes, devices, appliances to help make lives easier. This is what Americans wanted to do, and Harding wanted to encourage Americans to buy American-made products. Europe, however, is not too fond of this because after the war is over, the United States is the only market to sell their goods to because, again, after the war, Europe had dealt with millions of lives lost, territories that have been destroyed. They have to rebuild. And they're not in a position to buy consumer goods. America is because the United States, as we talked about, they saved their money for 4 years. They've worked in factories while saving their money. So they've had a lot of opportunity to wait for this opportunity for consumerism. It's now time for America to start buying things, and that's exactly what Americans do. The problem was Europe doesn't get too much access to this because Harding decides to raise import taxes on foreign goods, specifically coming from Europe. So if Europe wants to sell their goods are going to be a little bit more expensive than they used to, making American goods the more desirable of goods coming in. From his domestic policies, obviously with the war, people began, this fear of Germans, then switched to fears for all immigrants because of individuals bringing governmental styles that will want to do the country harm. So Americans become nativist, or by definition, only acceptable of native-born Americans. Grew out of the reasons that you see below. Obviously, many people believe you couldn't be patriotic unless you were born in the United States. The religion aspect, many of the United States is Protestant at this time. With immigrants, you have Orthodox Christians, Catholics coming into the country, a lot of Jewish people coming into the country. Not saying people became anti-Semitic, but because you didn't practice our form of Christianity, you couldn't be native-born Americans. So you couldn't seem like Americans. And that's exactly kind of where Americans hold on to this from. But you have also the urban conditions in the cities that are deplorable and at this time, because the immigrants that are rushing into the United States to try to eke out lives for themselves and their families, the deplorable conditions, the overcrowded cities, many people blame it on immigrants. Also, people believe that jobs were very scarce because of immigrants that were willing to be paid much less than native-born Americans. So you can see why Americans became only acceptable of those who were born in the United States. And this is something that has transcended throughout our time period. It's changed a little bit till today, but it still resonates with a lot of people in terms of immigration law, what reasons people have. But finally, the last part of it is what's called the Red Scare. Now, this is an assignment we'll talk about later. This Red Scare is pretty much having a fear of communists. When people had fears of Germans during World War I, this fear now changes to all immigrants, specifically immigrants coming from Eastern Europe and Russia, where they preach a form of communism. All right, where they want to see America's way of life altered for this new form of governing. All right, that's where a lot of these immigrants come in and try to preach these ideas. So in order to combat these nativist demands, or not combat, but to cater to these nativist demands, Harding establishes a quota system saying that we can still let immigrants in, but we will restrict immigration to only 3% of the current population of that ethnic group that currently resides in the United States. So if there's like 60 million, or let's say 10 million people that are of Polish descent in the United States at this time period, then we will only allow 300,000 people into the United States from Poland. That's 3%. All right, so that's kind of the whole idea behind this. This quota system to limit the number of people based on the current ethnic population. So, and pretty much what it does, it helps to maintain European immigration because there are not a lot of people that are from Mexico, from Central America, from Asia at this point in the United States. But it does restrict all immigration, but it also focuses immigration in mass numbers coming from Europe. All right, that is a concern for a lot of Americans. But Harding also proposed a lot of laws promoting African American rights. Some of those details aren't out there for us to really analyze, mostly because the Congress of the United States at this time doesn't really accept those laws as something that are worth passing. All right, it's not going to get people elected. People will get upset for getting African Americans' rights when people at home are struggling as well. Unfortunately, while Harding doesn't do a lot as president, from a standpoint having only several years in office, the one thing he is known for is his scandals. All right, he made poor choices at other cabinet positions, one of them being Albert B. Fall, Secretary of the Interior. As Secretary of the Interior, he was responsible for most of the national parks, the public lands that are protected by the federal government, whether they're for wilderness purposes, whether they're for resource purposes. The Secretary of the Interior, who is Albert Fall at this moment, is responsible for all those. Well, some of these areas are the lands that have oil on them, oil being a natural resource. Once oil is discovered, the government buys up that land from those that discovered the oil, and they keep that oil in reserve, essentially. They're oil reserves. Well, Albert B. Fall, being Harding's close friend, accepted payments from private oil companies and then gave those rights to drill on sanctioned government oil lands to take up that oil for those private oil companies. The problem is Albert Fall decides to pocket this money directly into his own accounts, not to the federal government. Now, granted, Harding knows probably what's going on here. Many people kind of speculate as to how much he knew about this situation or how much he did or did not know. But many people believe that the increased stress under Harding might have led to his death in the middle of his presidency in 1923. He has a heart attack while on a railroad trip out west, and he actually dies in a hotel in San Francisco. But the problem is when this is made public, Harding is already dead. He's already had his heart attack. He's already passed away. He cannot defend himself for Albert B. Fall. So people just began to assume because Albert Fall, who was Harding's close friend, was corrupt in this situation by accepting these financial payments personally himself, people believe that Harding was also the same way as well. After Harding passes away, Calvin Coolidge takes over from office. Now, people were afraid that Coolidge would be a part of Teapot Dome and he was a part of the corruption. Well, fortunately for Coolidge, based on his personality, a very different kind of personality, kind of a cold, mean-spirited kind of guy. But again, he was kind of a quiet introvert. Not really mean, but he was an introvert. He wasn't really open to a lot of small talk with people. He wasn't a glad-hander for like shaking your hand, making you feel good about that stuff. But people knew just based on his personality, he was not a part of Teapot Dome. All right. In fact, many people argue that he restored the dignity and prestige to the presidency. All right. And then when he takes his only year of presidency into 1924 for his own campaign, he runs on the phrase, "Keep cool with Coolidge." All right. And he's sworn in 1925, in January of 1925, by William Howard Taft, who is Chief Justice of the Supreme Court at this point. It's the first time a former president swears in a current president into office for inauguration. All right, so let's go to some of Coolidge's approach. This is his domestic policy. Put these up here for you. He believed in laissez-faire, hands-off approach. The best government could do is to leave business alone, which Congress supported. Congress did not push to pass laws that would increase government spending because they knew Calvin Coolidge would veto them. But even still, Congress supported a conservative approach. Congress supported how tight Calvin Coolidge was with the government's money because Calvin Coolidge was able to decrease taxes not once but twice. He did not like to spend the money. One of the big things that he denied was Mississippi River flood victims in the 1925 flood season, I believe, in Mississippi River. There's one of the worst floods the area's ever seen. Hits in the Mississippi River Delta, and Calvin Coolidge, when asked to provide aid, federal money to these people to help rebuild, he denies them that aid. So he's very tight with the government's money here, but almost is to a fault for how he does not like to spend money in this case. All right, let's get to the last slide here. So Calvin Coolidge's foreign policy, again, both of these guys don't do a whole lot, mostly because they didn't have to do a whole lot. 1920s is a very prosperous time in American history, so they don't have to do a whole lot here. But Calvin Coolidge did delegate, just like Harding did, but he has a great Secretary of State in Frank B. Kellogg to administer what's known as the Kellogg-Briand Pact from a foreign policy standpoint. Pretty much it's signed by 15 countries, and these 15 nations agreed that they would never threaten war in their negotiations. If they ever were talking with one another, if they ever discussed something, if ever they had conflicts with one another, they would never threaten war in negotiations or use that threat of war to get what they wanted in these negotiations. They would always reach their agreements peacefully. So Calvin Coolidge takes us towards the end of his presidency, and by the time 1928 rolls around, he feels like he has done enough as president. He leaves office, opening the door for another Republican named Herbert Hoover to win the 1928 election by a huge margin because Americans believed that under Hoover, the prosperity would continue. All right, that is all the notes I have here. Again, these two presidents in 15 minutes from a policy standpoint. This is a pretty boring topic, but in order to understand the 1920s from an economic and social standpoint, we have to understand these politics. All right, that's all I have. Everyone have a great day. Take a look at those videos later on.